You are standing in one of the most advanced cities on Earth. Gleaming subway lines, 5G internet on every corner, skyscrapers built by companies worth hundreds of billions. But in 1953, this exact city was rubble. The entire country was poorer than most of Africa. Here's what nobody told you about how South Korea went from zero to world class in a single generation, and why Koreans themselves barely learned the real story. In the summer of 1953, South Korea was a country on the edge of disappearance. The war had ended, but what remained was almost unrecognizable as a nation. United Nations surveys described a landscape stripped bare. More than 90% of all homes in Seoul were destroyed or uninhabitable. Over 80% of the city's shops, factories, and offices were reduced to twisted metal and burned out shells. Across the country, 85% of industrial capacity was gone. Steel mills, shipyards, and textile factories, if they existed at all, stood silent, gutted by shellfire and looting. The numbers defy belief. The entire economy, measured in gross national product, barely reached $4.5 billion. When divided among the population, the average income came to just $67 per person, a figure so low it ranked below nearly every country in Africa. In 1953, Ghana's per capita output was higher. Japan's was 4 times greater. West Germany, even after its own devastation, was 5 times richer per head. In South Korea, the word poverty did not begin to describe daily life. Food was rationed, children scavenged for firewood, and families lived in makeshift huts built from scrap. The human cost was just as staggering. 3 million civilians were dead, wounded, or missing. 2 million people in Seoul alone lost their homes. Across the peninsula, 2.5 million refugees crowded into the south from the north, and 1 million fled abroad. The country's population, once over 20 million, had fallen to 15 million by the war's end. Roads and railways were little more than lines of rubble. The main railway from Seoul to Busan was out of service for months. Only 1/3 of the pre-war farmland could be harvested, and agricultural output collapsed to 30% of what it had been. Schools stood empty or in ruins. Less than half the children who had attended class before the war were enrolled by 1954. Many teachers were dead or missing. Hospitals and clinics had no medicine. Electricity and clean water were luxuries, not rights. The country's social services, education, health, welfare had been gutted, leaving a generation to fend for itself. Survival depended on outside help. The United States and United Nations poured in food, clothing, and machinery. Between 1953 and 1960, the US alone sent $1.2 billion in military aid and $2.7 billion in economic grants and loans. The total, nearly $4.2 billion, worked out to $280 per person, an amount rivaling the Marshall Plan's support for West Germany, but for a country with none of Germany's industrial base. Even with this lifeline, the country hovered near collapse. There were no natural resources to exploit, no reserves of foreign currency, and no easy path to recovery. This was not just a poor country. It was a country that had been erased and was now being asked to start over. The scale of devastation, the depth of poverty, and the sheer impossibility of survival set the stage for a transformation that would later seem almost impossible. What happened next was not a miracle. It was a gamble, born out of desperation, with the entire nation at stake. A new story began to take shape in the classrooms of South Korea. As the country struggled to its feet, the Ministry of Education set out to write a different ending, one that would echo through generations. School books printed in the late 1980s and early 1990s told students that Korea's transformation was a miracle of national spirit and unity. In a 1989 civics textbook, a single line captured the message: "Through the tireless efforts of our people, we have risen from the ashes to become a proud, modern nation." But the story was carefully curated. The early pages described the ruins and hunger. then leapt to images of factories and gleaming new highways. Students learned about Park Chung-hee's 5-year plans as masterstrokes of leadership. Charts tracked the rise in exports, the building of the first steel mills, the emergence of Hyundai and Samsung as global names. The message was clear. Korea had achieved in a single generation what others could only dream of. What was missing was just as important as what was included. The textbook skipped over the martial law that kept protests off the streets. There were no chapters on the arrests of union leaders, the midnight raids on student activists, or the censorship that silenced critical voices. The Gwangju Uprising of 1980, where hundreds died demanding democracy, was reduced to a brief mention, if it appeared at all. Labor strikes in the shipyards and textile mills, the cost paid by ordinary workers, the fear that shadowed political life, these details faded into the background. Instead, the curriculum taught pride in overcoming poverty. Lessons focused on the leap from a $67 per capita income to a place among the world's top economies. Students recited the names of Chaebol founders alongside national heroes. The narrative was one of collective sacrifice and forward motion, not of conflict or repression. By the time a child finished high school, the story of South Korea's rise had become a source of identity. The rubble was gone, replaced by a sense of destiny. Yet beneath the surface, the full price of the transformation, what was lost, who was silenced, and how the nation was really rebuilt, remained largely unspoken. The official history offered pride and purpose, but it left a gap. For many, the true cost of the miracle would remain hidden between the lines. On May 16, 1961, tanks rolled through the heart of Seoul. Soldiers loyal to Major General Park Chung-hee swept aside the fragile civilian government in a single night. By dawn, the rules of the game had changed. The new regime wasted no time declaring that national survival demanded a new kind of order, one built on discipline, planning, and results. Within a year, Park's government issued Decree No. 1, dissolving the National Assembly and imposing martial law. The message was clear. Debate was over, action would define the future. In 1962, the Economic Planning Board, known as EPB, was born. This was not just another government office, it was a war room. The EPB's first task was to draft a 5-year economic development plan that could drag the country out of poverty. The plan's logic was as sharp as it was ruthless. The state would decide which industries lived or died. Banks, once private and scattered, were brought under government control. The Korea Development Bank and the Industrial Bank of Korea became the regime's main weapons. They were ordered to direct at least 30% of all new loans to industries chosen by the plan, steel, shipbuilding, electronics. Credit became a tool of power. If a company wanted to grow, it needed the state's blessing. If it resisted, it was cut off. The government dictated not only where the money would go, but what it would buy. Imported machinery, foreign technology, raw materials, every transaction was tracked. Every contract approved by the EPB. The goal was not to help every business, but to build a handful of giants strong enough to compete on the world stage. This was the origin of the Chaebol system. Family-run conglomerates like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG, all fueled by state-directed loans and tax breaks. The 5-year plan was more than a spreadsheet. It was blueprint for national transformation, written in the language of quotas and deadlines. Factories had to meet export targets or risk losing their funding. Managers were summoned to the Blue House to explain shortfalls in person. Failure was not tolerated. The government's grip extended to foreign exchange, labor relations, even the selection of executives. Every lever of the economy was pulled from a single command center. Park Chung-hee's vision was blunt. He believed that only centralized control, what he called guided capitalism, could deliver the growth the country needed. The gamble was enormous. If the plan worked, South Korea might escape the shadow of poverty. If it failed, the country could collapse again, this time with no one left to help. For better or worse, the blueprint was set. The next 5 years would test whether a nation could be rebuilt by decree, and whether the price of rapid progress would be measured in more than just economic statistics. On the Ulsan coast, Hyundai's shipyard rose from an empty shoreline, fueled by a 120 billion won government loan in 1976, an amount that eclipsed the company's own worth. The deal was strict, with performance quotas, export targets, and a government stake. Hyundai's founder, Chung Ju-young, accepted the terms, knowing every ship and every one would be scrutinized. Failure meant more than embarrassment. It threatened the entire growth model. Samsung's leap into semiconductors came with a 45 billion won loan in 1974 from the Korea Development Bank. The contract demanded Samsung supply 30% of Korea's chip exports and hand over a preferred share to the state. These were not gifts, but high-stakes wagers. The government picked its champions, expecting them to deliver results that would ripple across the economy. LG, then Lucky Gold Star, received a 3-year tax holiday for imported electronics in 1963. That single policy let the company assemble Korea's first radio Shikusen televisions, setting the stage for a consumer electronics powerhouse. The Ministry of Finance called these tax breaks experiments, tools to see which firms could turn privilege into export revenue. The results were staggering. From 1962 to 1986, South Korea's real GDP grew by an average of 9% a year. Exports transformed from a handful of textiles and wigs to steel, ships, cars, and microchips. By 1996, South Korea joined the OECD, standing among the world's richest economies. The engine behind this leap was deliberate. The state funneled credit, tax breaks, and licenses to a select group of conglomerates, demanding loyalty and relentless performance. The stakes for these Chaebol were immense. Missing a ship launch or export quota could unravel the model. Managers faced pressure from the Blue House and the banks. Targets were non-negotiable. The government's grip was firm, but the rewards were historic. By the late 1980s, Samsung accounted for nearly a fifth of Korea's electronics exports. Hyundai became a global shipbuilding force. LG dominated home appliances. Their rise mirrored the nation's own transformation. For most Koreans, the change was visible. Highways, high-rises, steady factory jobs. Official histories celebrated pride and progress, glossing over the risks and the state's heavy hand. The Chaebol ascendancy was engineered, an audacious experiment that delivered prosperity on a scale few imagined, but always at a cost. The winter of 1997 swept through South Korea with a chill deeper than the weather. For decades, the country had defied gravity, growing at a pace that stunned the world, joining the OECD and filling skylines with glass and steel. Then, almost overnight, the system buckled. Banks failed. The wind collapsed. Headlines spoke of bankruptcy. The International Monetary Fund arrived with a rescue plan, but the terms were severe. Slash public spending, cut wages, restructure corporations, and surrender economic control in exchange for a $58 billion lifeline. The government was ordered to cut spending by 3% of GDP, a move that threatened jobs and livelihoods across the country. In the middle of this crisis, ordinary Koreans stepped forward. The gold collection campaign began quietly in December. Within weeks, families lined up at banks and community centers, offering wedding ring, gold medals, and heirloom jewelry, anything that could be melted down to shore up the nation's reserves. Across the country, children handed over tiny bracelets. Elderly women parted with the last gifts from their parents. By March, more than 3.4 metric tons of gold had been collected, worth over $2 billion. The sight of citizens donating their most personal treasures became a symbol of collective sacrifice. It bought time for the government to stabilize the currency and meet IMF demands. But it also revealed something deeper. Beneath the headlines about Chaebols and skyscrapers, South Korea's survival still depended on the willingness of its people to give everything they had. The gold drive was not just a financial act, it was a communal answer to the threat of collapse, a reminder that the story of the nation's rise was written not only in boardrooms and ministries, but in the quiet courage of millions. Factories ran through the night, but not every worker was there by choice. In the 1970s and 80s, South Korea's economic miracle moved on the backs of men and women whose voices rarely made it into textbooks. At Pohang Steelworks in March 1974, a wage dispute ended with the military occupying the plant. 3 days of silence followed, broken only by the sound of boots and shouted orders. 312 workers were arrested. Their names never appeared in the official histories, but their absence was felt on the shop floors and in the empty beds of company dormitories. In Ulsan, the shipyards that launched Korea's industrial revolutions became the site of another confrontation. On June 15, 1978, nearly 1,800 workers protested dangerous conditions. Tear gas drifted across the docks. 58 were arrested, some sentenced to years in prison. The Ministry of Justice recorded the numbers in annual reports, but the details faded from public memory. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency, known as the KCIA, kept a unit dedicated to labor affairs. Between 1970 and 1980, more than 4,500 activists were detained, many without trial, some for nothing more than organizing a meeting or distributing leaflets. The cost of rapid growth was measured not only in steel and exports, but in the lives put on hold, the families separated, and the rights quietly suspended. For every gleaming skyscraper, there is a record of a midnight arrest or a silenced protest. The legacy of these years lingers, even as the country celebrates its rise. Every day in South Korea, the past is hiding in plain sight. The Seoul subway system, once a distant dream, now stretches across 23 lines, carrying millions through a city that rebuilt itself from ashes. Step onto a train and you are gliding over ground that, within living memory, was nothing but debris and mud. Above ground, the skyline is crowded with towers of glass and neon, each one a monument to a plan drawn decades earlier in a government office. On the roads, Hyundai and Kia cars fill the lanes, machines produced by the same conglomerates that once built ships for survival, now ranked among the world's top 5 automakers. Their logos are stamped on vehicles from Sao Paulo to Johannesburg. In the digital world, Samsung's microchips power more than 70% of the world's RAM memory. Every smartphone, every server farm, traces a line back to the factories that grew out of the first government loans and quotas. Even the music on the streets tells this story. K-pop, exported to every continent, is the product of an industry shaped by export incentives and government support. The ordinary routines, tapping a transit card, sending a text, streaming a song, are built on the bones of old policies and the risks taken by a generation that gambled everything. The evidence of South Korea's transformation isn't hidden in museums. It's in the subway tunnels, the chip foundries, the cars on the road, and the songs on every playlist. This is the visible legacy of a nation rebuilt by design, paid for in sacrifice, and now woven into the fabric of daily life. Today, a nation that once survived on $67 per person stands at the heart of global innovation. Yet beneath the glass towers, the true cost of that ascent, suppressed voices, erased memories, remains unresolved. As South Korea writes its next chapter, the story isn't just about what was built, but about what was hidden. The miracle is real. The full reckoning is still to come. Share your perspective below.